The church in Kit Carson was smaller than the shed Nathan Mercer had spent the better part of a month repairing on his own ground. It had frame walls, paint gone chalky on the weather side, and a handful of benches that would not have held 20 people. On that Saturday morning, it held 5. There was no music and no flowers. The bride wore the dress she had traveled in. The witnesses were the storekeeper and his wife, called in off the street, still wearing their aprons. The minister read quickly. He knew when people did not want the words drawn out. It took less than 4 minutes. When he finished and called them Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, the two of them stood still a beat longer than they needed to. Nathan Mercer was 30 years old and had never heard his name set beside the word Mrs. Adelaide Whitcomb had crossed more than 1,000 miles to stand there, and this was the 3rd time in her life she had seen the face of the man she had just married. Neither of them knew how to look at the other. Nate put out his hand. She took it. They both let go a little early. Out on the street, Saturday brought people in because Saturday was trading day, not because there was a wedding. Nate's wagon stood in front of the store, loaded since first light. He had bought his goods before the ceremony because he could not afford 2 trips to town. In the wagon bed were flour, rope, nails, lamp oil, and a new pick handle rising above the sideboard, its wood still pale. People looked at the pick handle before they looked at the bride. Everyone there knew which piece of ground Nate had bought and what he had paid for it. Everyone there knew why it had come cheap. An older woman came over and took Addie's hand in both of hers. She spoke plainly, and there was nothing cruel in it. "Keep enough money for the return fare." Addie's other hand went to the bag at her side for just an instant. She did not answer. Another woman looked down at Addie's hands and spoke to the person beside her, loud enough for Addie to hear. "Those aren't Colorado hands." Someone asked Nate whether he meant to bring a drilling outfit out. It sounded like a real question. Then someone laughed, and a man behind him answered for Nate. The machine cost more than Mercer's land did. Nate did not argue. He shifted the flour sack to sit the load square. Wes Hoyt stood on the store steps with his hat in his hand. He looked Addie over once, from her traveling shoes to her hat, then turned to Nate and said it to him, not to her. "A poor man ought to marry a woman who knows how to work." Addie heard every word of it. She was standing 3 steps away. Nate handed her up onto the wagon seat, one hand under her elbow, and said nothing. The mare pulled away from the hitching rail, hooves slow on packed dirt. The street ran straight and open, and there was nothing to stop sound. Behind them, nobody lowered their voice. They did not think the distance still carried. "Eastern woman. They can't take the summers." Another voice, older and level, spoke from behind them. "Give them till fall." Then someone added, "She'll be gone by then." None of them said it with malice. That was the worst of it. They had seen this before. They had seen men buy cheap ground and find out why it was cheap. They had seen women come off the train, stay through one summer, and go back east on the same line. To them, this was not a curse. It was experience. Addie did not turn her head. Nate did not change his hands on the lines. They both heard it. Neither of them said anything. The mare carried them past the last house in town and then past the Union Pacific pump house, stone-built, where the railroad had machinery to lift water for the engines that ran the Denver line. When the roofs had fallen away behind them, Nate spoke. He said he had already asked the price. They charged by the foot. A man had to commit to a minimum depth before they would come out at all. Casing cost extra, and after that he would still need something to bring the water up. Nate said the number out loud and did not soften it. Then he said it plainly. "I can't pay a machine. I can pay with my back." Addie looked straight ahead, at the road running down toward flat country with nothing standing on it. Nate drew up on the lines, and the wagon stopped. He told her that if she wanted, he would take her back to the depot right then and see her aboard the next eastbound. He would hold nothing against her. He did not mention the vows they had spoken that morning. Addie sat a while without saying anything. "I came to see the place." Would you have stayed after hearing what the whole town said? Let me know below and subscribe to Wild West Life for more stories from the American frontier. They rode a long while before either of them spoke again. The road ran east and then bent, and the country opened out and stayed open. The grass was short and going pale. A line of low ground lay somewhere off to the right and never seemed to come any closer. Addie had not known that a place could be this much of one thing. Is it as bad as they said? Some of it. Which part? The water. He did not add to it. She noticed that he had not lied, but he had not explained much either. She filed that away with the other things she had noticed about him since Friday, when he had met her at the depot and carried her trunk to the rooming house. He had come back once more that evening, only for a few minutes, to tell her the minister could do the ceremony Saturday morning if that suited her. Then he had taken off his hat, said good night, and gone. It was past 4 when the wagon came up onto the bench. The first thing she saw was that the cabin was small. The second thing she saw was that it was in good repair. The roof had been redone, and not cheaply. She could see where the new shakes ran in against the old ones, and where he had doubled them at the ridge. The door hung true. There was a shed with a patched wall, a corral, 6 chickens working the dust, and grass that had not been grazed hard because there was not enough stock on the place to graze it. He had built shelves along the north wall of the cabin. He had put in a new length of stovepipe. There were 2 bed frames, one against each wall, and he did not say anything about them, and neither did she. She stood in the door a moment, with her valise still in her hand. He had very little. He had made the little of it decent. Beyond the cabin, the ground dropped more than 20 feet before it leveled off and ran east toward the creek valley. There was a creek down there somewhere. It was 3 miles away, and it was not his. The well was 40 feet from the door. It was a hole with a low ring of stone laid up around the lip and a plank over most of it. Nate slid the plank back. The shaft went down into shadow and stopped being visible before it stopped. How deep? 11, 12 feet? The man before him had dug the first 8 or 9 feet, hit something hard, and quit. Nate had worked at the shaft through the spring, fitting the digging in around repairs to the roof, the shed, and the fence. He had taken it down another 3 feet. What did he hit? Nate crouched, picked up a piece of stone from the spoil pile, and put it in her hand. It was pale, heavy for its size, and did not crumble. That. And it goes on down. Some way. I don't know how far. Addie turned the stone over. How do you know there's water under it? He did not answer right off, and when he did, it was not an answer. He said the house was here and the stock would be here. A man did not want to haul water any farther than he had to. The fellow before him had picked this spot too, and a hole already this deep was worth finishing. Addie put the stone back on the pile. Right now the water came from Amos Rennick's, 3 miles northwest, in barrels on the wagon. Nate said it took the better part of a morning. He said it like a fact about the road rather than a complaint. That evening she opened the trunk. She found an apron, her sewing things, 2 notebooks, one of them blank, and seed packets wrapped in paper and tied. At the bottom was her father's old planting book, water-stained at one corner. Her father had farmed a field for 3 years that everybody agreed was poor ground. He had not put anything on it. Instead, he walked it after rain 4 or 5 times, watching where the water stood and where it went. Then he cut a ditch. He had told her once that before you fix a field, you find out what the water is doing. She set the book on the shelf Nate had built. He was banking the stove. He said, without turning around, "You don't have to work the well." "Why?" He looked at her hands. "Stonework." She understood that he meant it kindly. She also heard, underneath it, the same thing the street had said that morning. They built the windlass on Monday. The windlass was simple: two uprights sunk and tamped into the ground, a crosspiece, a drum Nate had shaped from a cottonwood butt over the winter, and a crank whose iron he had forged himself at Rennick's fire. He hung the rope, dropped the bucket, and drew it up empty twice to watch how it ran. Addie held the post plumb while he tamped. It was the first work they had done together. Then he went down. The arrangement was simple, and it did not change for 11 days. Nate worked the bottom with the pick and the bar and a short-handled shovel, filled the bucket, and called up. Addie turned the crank, brought the bucket to the rim, swung it off, carried the spoil clear, and sent it back down. The first morning she learned 4 things, all of them by getting them wrong. She learned that the bucket had to come up straight. If it struck the wall, grit rained down on the man below. It knocked twice before she found the rhythm. She learned not to stand where the load would come if the rope let go. She learned that the crank was not turned with the arms. Nate showed her without making anything of it. Hands here, weight back, let your own weight bring it round. After that it went easier for about an hour, and she learned about her hands. They were not soft hands. She had scrubbed and wrung and hauled and killed chickens since she was 9. But there is a difference between work and this, and by 10 o'clock the skin at the base of her fingers had gone shiny and hot, and by 11 it had opened. She kept turning. Sometime after noon the light went strange at the edges, and she found she was sitting down without having decided to. Nate came up the rope hand over hand and got her into the shade on the north side of the shed and put water in front of her and did not say anything about it at all. She was angry. Not at him. She said she was fine and stood up to prove it, and the ground tilted, and she sat back down. Nate waited until she had drunk the water. Then he went back down the hole. She was at the windlass again the next morning. She had thought about it most of the night. The next morning, she came out with her gloves on and strips of cloth wrapped over the worst of her palms beneath them. She stood clear of the bucket path and stopped to rest before she had to. She worked slower, and she lost nothing by it. Nate noticed. He did not say so. What he noticed was not that she was strong, because she was not. He noticed that she did not make the same mistake twice, that she did not need to be told a thing more than once, and that she came back out the next morning. The stone came slow. The pale, hard stuff took the pick and gave back inches. Some days they gained only a few inches. Once they gained most of a foot, and Nate came up that evening with his forearms shaking and ate everything on the table. The handle of the new pick began to darken where he held it. On the 6th day, a wagon came along the section line and slowed. 2 men Nate had hayed with, going down toward the Rennick place. One of them looked at the windlass and the spoil pile in the rope. The other looked at Addie, who was standing in the sun in a dress gone the color of the ground, with her sleeves rolled and cloth on her hands. "Still here, Mrs. Mercer?" "Apparently." The man laughed, not unkindly, and touched his hat brim. "Summer's young." The wagon went on. Nate's voice came up from the shaft asking who it was. She told him. He said nothing, and the bucket came up again. That night she sat by the lamp and worked at her palms with a needle, and did not make any noise about it. He was across the room with his back to her, seeing to something on the table. She thought he had not looked up. In the morning, the crank handle was wrapped in old harness leather, cut and fitted and tacked down at both ends, with a turn of cloth underneath. Addie stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she put her gloves on and started turning, and neither of them ever mentioned it. By the 10th day, the shaft was down past 20 feet, and Nate had stopped calling out the depth every evening because there was nothing new to say about it. At 22 feet, the stone still had not changed. There was no damp line on the wall and no smell of wet earth, something Addie had learned by now to notice because there was none of it anywhere on the place. There was only pale rock, the dust it made, and the sound of the pick. The sound was flatter now, with less give in it than there had been at 15 feet. Nate came up each evening grayer than the one before. He ate and did not talk much, and went back down in the morning. Addie had started walking the draw. The first time was not on purpose. She went down after the wash water, and the ground caught her eye because it held green a little longer than the bench did. After that, she went on purpose. The morning after a short, hard shower, before the sun had taken the shine off the ground, she walked the low line from the fence to where it dropped toward the creek valley. She watched where the water had run, where it had stood, and where it had already gone. She did not draw any conclusion from it. She only noticed that the bench where the well stood had none of these signs at all, anywhere. That evening she asked Amos Rennick's opinion, when Nate stopped there for the water barrels. Rennick did not know the ground the way a driller might have. He knew his own well, dug some 20 years earlier, and said it sat low, below the house. He remembered striking gravel somewhere down the shaft, though he could not say exactly how far because it had been a long time. His brother-in-law's well, 6 miles away, was nothing like it. That one had gone through solid clay and stayed dry as a bone. It was not an answer. It was two wells that disagreed with each other. That night, by the lamp, Addie told Nate about the field her father had walked after rain. "I think we're digging in the wrong place." Nate looked at the shaft outside the door, though it was too dark to see it. "We're 22 feet down. That doesn't make it the right 22 feet. He did not answer that either, not for a while. When he did, his voice had an edge in it she had not heard before. "Men who've lived here 20 years picked this spot. And did they find water?" He did not have anything to say to that, and the silence went on longer than either of them liked. He said the shaft was too far along to leave. Starting over meant losing the work they had already done, and they did not have enough summer left to spend another 2 weeks being wrong about a new spot. He was not shouting. He was doing what he always did, saying the practical cost out loud, until it sounded like a decision instead of a fear. Addie did not push it further that night. In the morning, he went back down the same hole. But before he went down, she saw him check her hands without being asked. He rewrapped a strip of cloth that had worked loose overnight and set the bucket where she would not have to reach as far for it. He never said he was doing any of it. He simply did it, then went down the rope. They were not agreed. They worked anyway. She turned the crank. He broke the stone. 22 feet became 23. Rennick met him at the gate this time instead of letting him fill straight from the trough. Rennick said it plainly, the way he said most things. His own stock water was running lower than he liked to see in July, and he could not keep letting Nate take a full wagon of barrels whenever he pleased. He was not unfriendly about it. Nate could still come, but not for all he wanted, and not as often. Nate said that was fair and did not argue it. On the way back, the off wheel hit a rut hard enough to crack the wooden rim and spring the iron tire loose. The wagon dropped a hand's width on that corner, and one of the barrels went over. A hoop had already been working loose, and when it let go, most of the water left in that barrel spilled into the road. Nate sat with the broken wheel a long time before he did anything about it. He walked the mare and wagon back at a crawl, the damaged wheel wobbling under what was left of the load. It was near dark before he reached the yard. He would need the wheelwright and Kit Carson to repair the wooden rim and reset the iron tire, along with new iron for the barrel hoop. A day would be lost going to town, and money would go with it. Addie had the lamp lit when he came in. She did not ask him to explain the wheel. She had seen the dark stain of spilled water on the road as he came up the track, already drying at the edges. That told her enough. She sat down with the notebook that night. She did not try to calculate how many gallons a horse ought to need, or what a book might say about it. She worked from what she had actually watched for 2 weeks. She knew how many barrels each haul brought, how many days that water lasted for the two of them, the mare and the chickens, and how much of a morning each trip cost. She also knew what the account in her notebook could still afford after the wheelwright and the barrel repair were paid. Nate came and stood behind her chair, not saying anything, while she finished the sum. She read it back once to be sure of it herself. How long? 3 weeks. Less if the mare loses another day. He did not say anything to that for a while. Then he went out to look at the wheel again in the dark, which told her more than any answer would have. Over the next few days, he stayed in the shaft longer than before, even after the light had stopped being good for the work. He broke another 1.5 feet of stone. His face grew thinner, and he was short with himself, though not with her. He ate less. Once she caught him standing at the bottom of the ladder with one hand on a rung, not climbing, simply standing there. That afternoon he sat down against the shady side of the cabin and did not go back to the shaft. Addie brought him water and set it down beside him. They were right about one thing. What? You shouldn't have come here. For a moment she thought he meant exactly what it sounded like, and something in her went cold and still. Then he said the rest. You deserved better than this. He was not really talking about the ground. He had nothing else to offer her but that ground, and the ground was giving him nothing back. In his mind, a man who could not bring water up out of the earth for his own wife had failed at the one thing he was supposed to be able to do. Do you want me to leave? No. Silence held between them. Then stop deciding for me. He looked at her for a moment, the way he had not looked at her since the church, and did not say anything else. That evening, after Nate had gone quiet over the claim accounts, Addie walked past the well to where the ground began its long fall toward the draw. The light was going soft and low across it. She stood there for a while without thinking about depth, gravel, or anything her father might have said. She thought about the 2 weeks of water they had left, and the dry hole that held her husband's whole summer. Somebody was going to have to make a decision soon, and it could not go on being only him. In the morning, she took him down to the draw before he could go back to the old shaft. She walked him to the low point of it, where the ground pinched in and the grass stood greenest, even now, in the dry part of summer, and where the soil under her boot heel was dark almost to the surface. Here. Nate stood looking at the spot a long moment without answering. Then he crouched and studied the ground the way he studied a wall before trusting his weight to it. A few feet upslope, he pointed out a line of old debris caught against a clump of grass. Dried stems, a scrap of bark, and grit banked into a thin ridge. He said that was where the water had stood after the last hard rain, not simply passed through. The spot she had chosen sat square inside that line. He said that if they sank a shaft there, the first real storm would pour straight into it. Muddy runoff would fill the hole. The banks would slough because they would never get a chance to firm up between wettings. A well there would not stay a well. It would be a drain with a rope in it. Addie said nothing for a moment. She had looked at grass and shade and dark soil, and had not once looked at where the water actually ran when it came down hard, only at where it lingered afterward. It was the mistake of somebody who had watched a field from the edge of it and never had to keep a wall from falling in on a man's head. You're right. She said it plainly, the same way he might have said it, and did not make more of it than that. They did not go back to the house. Instead, they walked to the edge of the draw together, upslope from the channel, testing the ground with the bar every few yards. They did not go deep, only far enough to feel what lay under the first foot of soil. In 2 places they hit sand almost at once. In another, they hit the same pale hard stone that had beaten the first well, and they moved on without discussing it further. In the end, Nate found a promising place, though neither of them called it that at the time. It was a shelf of ground on the terrace edge, high enough above the floor of the draw that no debris line reached it, but low enough to sit well below the bench where the old well stood. Here, the bar went into looser, easier ground before it struck anything hard. There. Addie looked back toward the cabin. It was a long way, farther than the old well by a good measure. "That's a long way to carry water." "It's shorter than carrying it 3 miles. He did not have an answer to that. They agreed without saying the word. First, they needed water. They could manage the distance later with a trough near the well and some way to sled or wagon barrels up to the house. If the well held, they might eventually move the shed and the stock closer. That could wait. For now, the only question was whether there was water to be had at all. That left the old shaft. Nate walked back up to it alone before noon. Addie did not follow him at first. She watched him stand at the rim a while, looking down into the 23-foot shaft he had spent weeks deepening by hand. Then he began taking the windlass down. He did it without ceremony. He pulled the rope free, worked the crossbar loose, and eased the uprights out of the ground he had tamped them into. Addie came up and took the other end of the crosspiece without being asked. Together, they carried the rig down off the bench and set it up again on the new ground. Neither of them said anything about what it had cost him to do that. That evening, he covered the old shaft with the same plank that had covered it since spring. He weighted the plank with stone so nothing would fall in, then left it that way, like a door shut on a room nobody had decided to empty yet. Before they cut the first shovelful of new ground, they cut back on every non-essential use of water. There would be no garden that year. Wash water got used twice before it went out, and Addie let the laundry go longer between washings than she would have liked. None of those cuts touched what the mare drank, what the chickens needed, or what the house required. Addie went back through her figures with the new savings included and told Nate what she had. 4 weeks, maybe a little more, if nothing breaks. It was not much more room than they had had before. It was room enough to try. The ground gave easy for the first 10 feet. For the first 10 feet, there was no stone at all, only soil that grew darker and cooler the deeper Nate cut. Then came a band of sand that took the shovel like flour. He called up the depth each evening now because there was something new to say. Addie kept the notebook at the rim. This time she was not recording gallons or fare. She wrote the depth, the day, and what the material from the shaft looked like at each level. She did not say why she was keeping the record, and Nate did not ask. She did not say to him either that she had chosen wrong once. She had said it once, to him, at the draw, and that was enough. She worked the crank and did not bring it up again, and neither did he. Past 10 feet, the sand ran loose and started coming in ahead of the shovel, sliding down off the wall faster than Nate could clear it. He stopped and came up and stood looking down at it a while. After that, they lined the loose section with stone. They carried flat pieces down from the old spoil pile on the bench, and the same stone that had beaten the first well now held up the walls of the second. Addie sorted the pieces by hand while Nate worked below. She chose the flattest stones and passed down the ones that would sit close. Nate fit them into a ring against the loose ground and tamped smaller pieces behind them to close the gaps. It slowed them. It also meant the walls stayed where they were put. On the 12th day of the new shaft, a section of wall let go, less than an hour after Nate had come up for dinner. There had been no warning, only a soft settling sound. Then, most of a day's work fell back to the bottom in a heap of loose dirt and stone. Nobody was under it. That was the whole of the good news in it. Nate wanted to go back down that afternoon and start clearing it. "We've lost a day. I'd rather lose a day than a husband." He stood at the rim with the rope in his hand and did not say anything for a moment. Then he set the rope down. They cleared it the next morning in the cool part of the day. Nate reset the lining 2 feet farther back from where it had failed, and this time it held. That week, part of Addie's fair money went for new rope. The old coil had worn thin in 2 places under the weight of the stone and was no longer safe enough to trust with a man's life. Addie made nothing of it. In her notebook, she crossed through part of the eastbound fare entry and wrote the new figure beneath it. Nate saw the page open on the table that evening. He said nothing about it, and neither did she. Past 18 feet, they hit hard ground again. They both felt the change. Nate felt it through the handle of the bar, while Addie heard it in the flatter sound, the same sound the first well had made against hard stone. Neither of them said what they were thinking. "Looks familiar." It does. This time, they did not know what the hard layer meant. Addie had already been wrong once about what a piece of ground would give them. Nate had spent a month being wrong about the same thing on the bench above. Without much discussion, they agreed on a fixed distance they would go before stopping to think again. It was not an open-ended promise like the first well. This time, they had a number. They did not call it his hole anymore, either one of them. It had stopped being his and had never quite become hers. Now, it was simply the well. Past 20 feet, the stone came back, and it came back hard. Progress went to inches, then less than that. A whole morning might gain only a few inches of rock. Nate's palms had thickened, split, and thickened again over the weeks. The handle of the pick was now dark and worn smooth where his grip fell, with none of the pale wood of the first week left there. One evening, Addie took the pick from beside the door and bound a strip of old harness leather around the haft, just below where his hands closed on it. She tacked it down the way he had once done for her on the crank. She said nothing about it. In the morning, Nate picked it up, turned it once in his hands, and went down the rope without a word. One evening, low and quiet over what was left of supper, Addie said what she had been turning over for days. She said she had pulled him away from one dry hole. Now there were nights when she wondered whether all she had done was lead him down to a second one, only farther from the house. Nate did not try to talk her out of it. "Maybe." Then he added, "But this one we chose knowing why." He was not trying to comfort her. It was not comfort exactly. The difference was that he had defended the first 22 feet out of stubbornness, while they were cutting these 28 feet for reasons they had chosen together. Both of them understood that difference, even if neither would have put it into those words. They agreed on the number they had settled on, and did not go past it lightly. Near the end of that stretch, a load came up different. Nate sent the bucket up without saying anything. Addie tipped it onto the spoil pile the way she had 100 times before, then stopped. The stone in this load was darker than the stone above it. Not gray, but closer to the color of wet slate. When she picked up a piece, it felt cool against her palm in a way the dry rock never had. She called down to him. He came up and turned the piece over in his hands, and did not say anything for a moment either. They did not celebrate. Damp stone was not water. Both of them had learned that a hopeful sign on this ground meant only that the next few inches mattered more, not that anything was assured. Nate went back down and cut another few inches. Near a seam in the rock, a thread of moisture appeared, thin as a hair. It beaded along the crack and did not run anywhere at all. Addie wanted to keep going. Nate said to let it sit overnight. They came out before first light. Nate lifted the plank and lowered the lantern. At the bottom, where every layer before it had been dry, a thin skin of water lay dark and still across the floor of the shaft. Neither of them said a word for a while. It was not deep. It was not a spring breaking loose or anything that announced itself. It was only water, sitting where no water had been the evening before. They bailed it clear that morning, mud and all, to see what the ground would give back on its own. Nate climbed down twice more that day to check. Both times, the water had crept back in. It came more slowly than it had the first time, but it came steadily. An inch, then most of another. It would not fill a herd's trough or run an irrigation ditch. Carefully managed, though, it would be enough for the house, the mare, 6 chickens, and a garden small enough to water by hand. That evening, Addie was coiling the last of the rope when she realized Nate had not come to help her. He stood at the rim of the new well, looking back toward the bench. The cabin sat small against the sky, and the ground between the well and the house rose nearly 25 feet before it leveled out. He looked at the well. Then he looked up at the bench again. Weeks ago, he had believed a few more feet would have done it. He said nothing about it to her. He bent down, picked up his end of the rope, and together they carried the coil back to the cabin. By the middle of September, the well had a proper cover and a low trough Nate had built beside it. Weeks of boots had worn a track between the well and the cabin, and the newer drag marks of the barrel sled now crossed over the old footprints. The garden beds were turned, but not yet planted. It was too late in the year for that, but they were ready for spring. Addie had taken the seed packets back out of the trunk and set them along the windowsill, where afternoon light fell across them. Nate had not filled in the old shaft. He had capped it and fenced it square with what scrap rail he had, and hauled the rest of the spoil stone down to set his footing under the new trough. It cost too much work to pretend it wasn't there. That was all Addie said about it, and it was all that needed saying. Wes Hoyt came by on a Tuesday with a wagon of freight and pulled up at the fence. It was the way a man stopped when he meant to look at something rather than simply pass it. He looked at the well for a while, then at Nate. "How deep?" Nate told him. Hoyt looked over at Addie, who was working a coil of rope at the sled, not paying him any particular mind. "She picked the spot?" "We did." Hoyt considered that. Then, without quite looking at either of them, he spoke in the tone of a man settling an old account. "Thought she'd be gone by fall." Addie did not look up from the rope. "Fall isn't over yet." Hoyt gave one short laugh, touched his hat, climbed back onto his wagon, and went on toward Kit Carson. That evening they sat outside the cabin door while the light went long and gold across the bench. Nate was quiet for a while, turning something over. "We could put the garden lower next year, nearer the well." Addie waited. "We could save toward a cow come spring, if the well holds through winter the way it's holding now." He looked at the second bed frame against the far wall. "Might take that apart before the snow comes. Good lumber in it. Shelving maybe, or something the well trough could use." Addie said nothing to that either. She only nodded once, and it was settled the way most things between them had come to be settled that summer, without much ceremony, and without either of them making more of it than it was. She noticed, without remarking on it, that he had not said "I" once the whole time he'd been talking. "Still planning on leaving? Ask me after winter." He almost smiled at that. In the morning, they walked down to the well together. They filled the trough first, then set the barrel on the sled for the house. One last bucket remained, drawn fresh for the morning coffee. When it came to the rim, Nate did not carry it alone the way he might have in June. He took one side of the handle. Addie took the other. They carried it back to the cabin between them. The ground was still dry on either side of the worn path. The cabin was still small against the sky, and the claim was still poor by any measure a stranger passing through might have used. But there was water in the bucket, and there were two of them carrying it. I think the people in Kit Carson were wrong about Nate and Addie, but not because their doubts were foolish. From the outside, the odds really were against them. He had little money and a piece of ground that had already defeated another man. She had crossed half a country to marry someone she barely knew, and she had never done the kind of work that place demanded. What nobody could see on their wedding morning was the thing that mattered most. Nate could learn to stop digging when effort had turned into stubbornness. Addie could admit when her own judgment was wrong. Somewhere between those two lessons, they stopped being two strangers trying to survive the same summer and became partners. The well gave them water, but I think learning how to work beside each other was what really gave that little claim a future. If you enjoyed this story, tell me in the comments whether you think you would have stayed if you were Addie. And subscribe to Wild West Life if you'd like to hear more stories from the frontier. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.